There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
This video was made possible due to those who support me on Patreon, and I'd like to give a big shout out to patrons Cheshire, Dan Ray, Flake, Harrison, Joseph Abrams, Majin Weeaboo, Ness Lee, and Stephen Dillon. Thank you all for your support. So, I'm going to be bending the rules for this one, considering that when I began my Miracle Disaster series, I gave myself the restriction of only analyzing a TV series if it was wrapped and finished, either as a result of premature cancellation or the narrative coming to a set conclusion, for better or worse, as I feel it is only fair to judge a show in its entirety. However, and despite it being set to air at the very least a full 4 years following the conclusion of its most recent season, Season 3 of Euphoria is currently in the works, which I find frankly astounding for a number of reasons. Many members of the cast now being major film stars who I would presume would rather move on with their careers, the tragic passing of Angus Cloud, who plays arguably the most likable character on the show, and the fact that creator and showrunner Sam Levinson, for reasons which I'll dive into later on, seems like a spiteful, self-aggrandizing slug. But the main reason I doubted Season 3 would ever end up happening is that, despite Season 1 being a solid, if in my opinion slightly overrated start, Season 2 was an utterly confounding mess, which, upon its conclusion, left me baffled as to where things were supposed to go from here. And not in a, wow, I sure am excited and intrigued to see how things unfold sort of way, but in a, you either fumbled or straight up abandoned the arcs of every major character and thus demolished any investment I had in the show sort of way. To the point where I don't think there is a chance in hell that Season 3 will be able to resurrect what is, in my eyes, the zombified corpse of a once promising series. Therefore, I am at peace with my decision to analyze it as it stands today. This video will be a complete breakdown of Seasons 1 and 2 of Euphoria, discussing the progression and regression of each primary character's arc, followed by a conclusion in which I will discuss what I find to be the show's greatest failure, which is how, in an attempt to appear more prestige, I suppose, it ends up rejecting the earnestness that I would argue is a staple of the traditional teen drama, opting instead for a surplus of exploitative melodramatic schlock smothered in an excess of garish visual exhibition, all of which ends up drowning out the rare occasions when it does strike gold by relying on genuine empathy and focusing on raw characterization, which not only leaves me baffled as to what lesson, if any, I am meant to take away from the series as a whole, but seeing as it touts itself as a modern take on the classic coming-of-age narrative, yet throws sincerity aside so as to arrogantly frame itself as elevated in comparison to more wholesome tales of the past, ultimately leaves me asking, who the f*** is this show even for? Spoilers for Seasons 1 and 2, as well as both special episodes. Also, while Euphoria is technically an adaptation of the Israeli series of the same name, I won't be discussing it as I did not watch it in the process of making this video, since I didn't feel it was necessary, as I understand they don't really have all that much in common with one another. And also because, even if I wanted to, I have no idea how to watch it with added English subtitles, and I don't feel like learning Hebrew.
You hate Jews!
And with all that said, let's begin. For those of you who may have forgotten that McKay was a character in Euphoria, no hard feelings, so did Euphoria. For those of you who do remember McKay, you will know that there isn't much to say, considering that, while Season 2 fumbled the arcs of most of its primary characters, it just straight up abandoned McKay's. He shows up at the beginning of the season at the New Year's Eve party to break up with Cassie, and to tell Nate to,
"Oh, you were a cop? Chill. You dirty mother. Chill. Yo, you coming? Chill."
But otherwise is effectively written off the show following the premiere. As for why, some theorize that after the original actor set to play McKay, Brian Bradley, exited the show during the filming of season 1, Levinson simply lost interest in the character, possibly going so far as to reduce his presence altogether, there allegedly having been a scrapped season 1 story arc of McKay experimenting with homosexuality, the initial inclusion of which was one of the reasons Bradley dropped out. But I think the more likely explanation is that since McKay is in college, and thus disconnected from the other major characters who are primarily still in high school, Levinson simply didn't know how to incorporate him following the end of his relationship with Cassie. Which is a damn shame, considering I think his storyline is one of the most timely and relatable of the show, specifically in regard to how warped his view of intimacy becomes due to the influence of his male peers. In contrast to the likes of Nate, we see that McKay is a genuine soul, sensitive, kind. He doesn't view Cassie as a trophy to show off to his bros, but rather as someone he has a genuine connection with. Yet, sadly, we witness how his insecurities end up sabotaging said connection, namely in the pilot when he is overly rough in bed with Cassie at the behest of Nate. Like many men whose only exposure to sex since adolescence was via pornography, McKay doesn't view it as an enjoyable act to partake in with someone he cares for, but rather a performance, a means to prove his manhood to himself, to Cassie, to others, who knows. Their relationship becomes further strained when McKay shows reservations about Cassie's sexual history. He doesn't seem particularly bothered by Cassie having been with other men. Rather, he is more concerned with how her promiscuous reputation reflects on him, resulting in him downplaying the nature of their relationship and shaming her for wearing a revealing Halloween costume. We see McKay allow the perception of others to dictate his behavior, which in turn negatively impacts his relationship with Cassie, all of which culminates in one of the show's most disturbing scenes, in which McKay is mock assaulted by a group of frat bros in front of Cassie. Humiliated, McKay responds by engaging in rough, dispassionate sex with her, seemingly in an attempt to compensate for his emasculation. In this moment, he sees her as nothing more than an object through which he seeks to solidify his own sense of manhood. Later, after Cassie informs McKay that she is pregnant, he shows little care for her well-being, seemingly only concerned with how the pregnancy affects his own future prospects. Cassie ultimately ends up getting an abortion. It is at this point that any softness between them has dissipated, McKay and Cassie's season 1 arc being a simple yet effective cautionary tale of how peer pressure and toxic masculinity can erode one's self-esteem and destroy what was once a sincere connection. However, once he splits with Cassie at the beginning of season 2, McKay loses his only foothold in the scope of the larger story. On one hand, I think having them break up was the right call, as opposed to dragging it out or making it a will they won't they thing. However, it was disheartening to see how little the writers seemed to care about McKay outside of his dynamic with Cassie. And so, once they are done, what else is there left to explore? Gee, maybe the entire other element of his character that the show sets up only to completely discard. We learn that McKay was pushed by his father to be a football star with aspirations of playing professionally. But once he realizes that his chances of making it to the NFL are DOA, he is forced to bear witness to the path he had mapped out for his future crumble beneath his feet. How does McKay react upon realizing he is not as special as he once thought? Does he feel guilty for not living up to his father's expectations, or does he feel resentment towards him for putting him through hell only to wind up driving down a dead-end street? Where does he go from here? Does he find a new passion? Well, the answer Euphoria has to these inquiries is,
I do not care.
While I understand that this facet of McKay's arc isn't exactly groundbreaking, even bordering on being a bit cliche, There is a reason narratives like this are seen again and again in media. They are, in a sense, timeless. Thinking you know where your life is going, only to have reality deliver a brutal haymaker unto your wide-eyed innocence, is something that most, if not all young adults, will experience at some point in their lives, in one form or another. But I suppose for Levinson, how a young adult grapples with the uncertainty of life just doesn't make sense in a show whose audience is composed primarily of young adults grappling with the uncertainty of life. Let's get back to sex tapes and police raids. Gotta keep it relatable, am I right, fellow kids? McKay's omission stings even more, considering he was really the only character through who the writers could depict a more genuine and realistic male experience, and offered a surprisingly fresh and timely take on the struggles that young men face in today's day and age. Granted, the show has Fez, but he's more or less wrapped up with crime drama ballyhoo. And then there is, of course, Nate, who,
Whoa, just take it easy, man.
We'll get to him later. In any case, I hope we see where McKay winds up in Season 3. Even if it is only a single scene that gives us some insight into where his life is headed, and/or offers a sense of closure to his story. Which I don't see why the show couldn't do. It's not like McKay had his character full-on betrayed. It's not like the bridge was totally burned. It's not like his treatment in Season 2 was indicative of Levinson intending to purposefully sabotage the character out of spite. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for... I consider this one to be the most insulting of the bunch. While Kat in Season 1 was a surprisingly refreshing take on a rather stale archetype, her arc in Season 2 feels more like a deliberate spurning of an actress who deserved so much more. Kat's arc in Season 1 is more or less a play on the overweight girl finds confidence shtick, but it ends up subverting this very early on. When I think of other shows that utilize this trope, while they may be well-intentioned, there's often an unintentional yet condescending underpinning, the character's weight being framed as a dysfunction to be overlooked. Sort of a, you're pretty for a fat girl sort of vibe. But in the case of Kat, while the show at first seems like it's going to head in this direction, it sidesteps falling into the same old tired motif. Kat is introduced as insecure both as a result of her lack of sexual experience and the belief that no one finds her attractive due to her weight. But after a sex tape of her losing her virginity leaks online, she is shocked to find that there are plenty of people who find her desirable, and she decides to take charge of her own sensuality. The key is that it never comes off in that condescending way I spoke of earlier. The male characters she ends up getting with don't desire her in spite of her weight, nor do they fetishize her. She realizes that it wasn't her weight holding her back, but her own self-imposed limitations. Rather, Kat's arc is, I would say, more about a young woman struggling with her need for validation. While I think there is always a fake it till you make it phase on the road to gaining self-confidence, at what point does putting on a front for the world become just another coping mechanism? Are Kat's actions as a result of what she actually wants, or is she simply kowtowing to the wants of men in order to keep getting the validation she seeks? While on the surface, Kat may appear self-assured, she is, in a sense, the same girl she was before, dependent on others to give her a sense of worth. Again, not the most revolutionary arc, but still relatable to many a young adult, and it was nice to see the character not restricted to an outdated archetype. But this comes with the caveat that in order to view all of this in a not sketchy light, you have to sort of ignore the fact that Kat is a minor uploading sexually explicit videos to the internet. I'd like to think the show is cognizant of this, and we are meant to view Kat's arc in sort of a darkly ironic fashion. The strongest evidence for this is the scene where she becomes uncomfortable while performing on cam for some sketchy dude. If I were to be charitable, I would argue that the show is aware of the questionable nature of this aspect of Kat's storyline and is attempting to make some sort of larger point. But considering how poorly the show handles other sensitive themes, I don't know if I can give them that much credit. Does the show want us to view this as empowering or exploitative? I honestly don't know, nor do I think the show itself knows. Regardless of your view on the morality or ethics of sex work, the fact that Kat is underage makes this entire plot thread a strange inclusion, considering we already see her convey her sexual autonomy via other means, so the webcam stuff isn't particularly necessary. If you are able to look past all that, Kat's arc does come to a surprisingly wholesome conclusion, her ultimately coming to a sort of equilibrium. No longer the coy, insecure girl from the beginning of the season, nor having to constantly put up a front that she has it all together. Via her romance with the character of Ethan, she has found someone from whom she doesn't have to hide her true self. Probably the most satisfying of all the character arcs of Season 1. But now, we must unfortunately discuss Kat's treatment in Season 2. Reports indicate that there were clashes between Levinson and actress Barbie Ferreira, in regard to what direction to take the character. Levinson having originally planned for Kat to struggle with an eating disorder, something Barbie was firmly against. I would like to think that anyone with half a brain would be on Barbie's side on this one, considering that having Kat form an ED would go against the entire point of her arc in Season 1. Kat being overweight was not what was holding her back, so her losing weight would not have remedied her inner struggle, something Barbie clearly understood. I have to say, it really pumps my nads whenever I see an actor fight to do their character justice, even in defiance of the creator themselves. Mad respect to her for doing so. Yet, whether or not it was out of spite towards Barbie for having the audacity to speak out against him, it is clear that Levinson didn't put much thought into Kat's arc come Season 2. While it at first seems like all is peaches and cream between Kat and Ethan, cracks begin to form. Kat not feeling as strongly for Ethan as he does for her. The issue is that the show can't seem to make up its mind as to why Kat no longer fancies him. On one hand, it seems to imply that Ethan is too sweet and or not manly enough for her, but then on the other, it implies that there really isn't anything particularly wrong with Ethan. Kat is simply unable to accept his love because she is still dealing with low self-confidence. But neither is developed sufficiently. Kat just stops liking Ethan, and the show doesn't seem to be interested in exploring why. Then there is that really odd scene where Kat is bombarded by a bunch of online influencers, which I think was meant to be critical of toxic positivity and how the concept of self-love has been commodified, which, fair enough, but how does this factor into Kat's arc? It's also scattershot and unfocused. And then there is the scene where she finally tries to break things off with Ethan, lying to him about having a brain disease or something, which Ethan sees through immediately. Him realizing that she wants to break up, but can't bring herself to just be honest, so he does it for her. Again, I have no evidence that Levinson had it out for Barbie, but damn does this scene make a good case for it. Instead of her being open and vulnerable as she is with Ethan at the end of Season 1, it's like this scene was specifically designed to make Kat seem as petty and obnoxious and conceited as possible. For the rest of the season, she just sticks to Maddy's side and does absolutely nothing of note. In ironically disappointing fashion, Kat ends up becoming indicative of the trope of the fat best friend, something Barbie specifically stated she didn't want to see happen. As much as I would love to see the show do right by Kat in Season 3, it was reported in 2023 that Barbie made the decision to depart from the series. Since then, Barbie has handled the fallout with grace and professionalism, not speaking ill of Levinson and squashing any rumors that there was beef between them. Though, I can't help but feel there is a great deal of resentment behind Barbie's exit, her stating as to why she decided to step away.
Sam writes for things that he relates to. I don't think he relates to Kat.
Nor does it seem like he was able to put his ego aside and listen to the one person who actually did. She went to bat for her character, but unfortunately, her passion fell upon deaf ears. Well, that was depressing. Let's shake things up a bit by discussing perhaps the only instance of Season 2 improving on a character's arc. Though that isn't really saying a whole lot, considering Lexi isn't as much of character in season 1 as she is a background prop. We get the gist: meek, shy, pushover, rad taste in Halloween costumes, but she doesn't play any major role in the lives of the other characters. In and of itself, this would be fine. Not every character needs to be given an entire full-fledged arc. But what makes Lexi being relegated to the background so odd is her stated dynamic with the show's primary protagonist. Early on, we are told that Rue and Lexi were once best friends, but drifted apart as a result of Rue's substance abuse. And yet, Rue and Lexi feel like complete strangers. I get the point is that they have become estranged, and that's not to say the times that they do share the screen are bad. The stylized sequence where they act as private eyes, trying to figure out what's going on between Jules and Nate, being particularly inspired. But you would think that if these two considered themselves one-time best friends, we would see more interaction between them. Lexi making more of an effort to reach out to Rue. Rue calling upon Lexi in times of turmoil, aside from asking her for piss. Us seeing their friendship slowly mend. Have Lexi act as the link to Rue's former self. And through their dynamic, we the audience are able to gain insight into how much Rue's drug use has snuffed out the person she used to be. Now, one could argue that since we see the effects of Rue's drug abuse via her dynamics with other characters, her mother Leslie, sister Gia, Ali, even Fez, the contrast of Rue's disposition pre and post addiction is already communicated. However, then my question is, what is Lexi's function in the narrative? Not every character has to exist only in the context of their relationship to other characters, but outside of her dynamic with Rue, Lexi doesn't have that much else going on. Lexi just pops up every now and then to remind the audience she is in the show. But alas, if the show wants to keep her as more of a minor character, I don't suppose there is anything inherently wrong with that. But come season 2, Lexi steps into the spotlight, beginning with her blooming romance with Fez. Her seeing him be so kind and warm, only to then witness him beat the soul out of Nate, acting as a sort of wake-up call, making her reflect on how she has always been nothing more than a quiet observer and how this has negatively impacted not only her life, but the lives of others. Namely, her not speaking up about Rue's drug use, which in turn led to her guilt over not acting in time to prevent her overdose. And thus, she decides to turn things around. She pursues her romance with Fez, and, of course, begins production on a play based on her observations into the lives of the other characters. Its debut being the focus of the final 2 episodes of the season, and which acts as a sort of meta-esque commentary on the show itself. However, putting aside how silly it is to think Lexi could possibly convince the school board to let her put on her own original play, especially considering the subject matter, also what kind of budget does this theater department have at its disposal? The main issue with the meta-esque nature of the play is that it reveals the series as being so utterly and obnoxiously far up its own ass. This is going to sound wild, but the closest example I can think of to compare with Lexi's play in Euphoria is the Ember Island players of Avatar: The Last Airbender. In both cases, our primary characters attend a theater performance that acts as a sort of mock recap of their shenanigans over the course of the show. However, in the case of the Ember Island players, there is a clear tongue-in-cheek tone, the writers poking fun at the characters and at themselves. It comes off as self-effacing, and thus, to the audience, charming. Whereas in Euphoria, it comes off as egregiously self-important, like the show is trying to make some grand statement about how life is a performance and all the world's a stage, or whatever. Further cemented by Cassie interrupting the performance and the audience not knowing if it is part of the play. Wow, much meta. Also consider, the Ember Island Players is the penultimate episode of the series. It's serving as a victory lap for the show, if you will. Meta shit like this works best when it is towards the tail end of a series. Like the writers are breaking the fourth wall as a way to thank and say farewell to the audience. As for Euphoria, this is the second season finale, and it's not like Levinson thought this was going to be it. He really seems to think this highly of himself, that he has crafted some insightful commentary on the nature of reality and perception or something. Ladies and gentlemen, in preparation for takeoff, please securely fasten your seatbelts. And to the gentleman in seat 21B, we would kindly request for you to remove your own cock from your mouth. Furthermore, when it comes to going meta, you either have to go all the way, like full-on Synecdoche New York style, or use it very sparingly.
Come on, Feeney, you haven't even talked to another student for 7 years. I mean, you might...
Avatar restricted it to a single episode. But Euphoria dedicates the entire 2-part finale to this crap, which conversely ends up undermining the goodwill of the audience. Why should I buy into the reality of and become invested in these characters' experiences when you undercut this by framing them all in the context of a theater performance? Putting all of that aside, the play fails to deliver on what I presume was its main function, which was to serve as Lexi's final plea to Rue. Lexi was unable to articulate how heartbroken she was as a result of losing her best friend, but is able to communicate this via the play. Rue, bearing witness to how much Lexi cherished their friendship and how its loss was so devastating to her, finally acknowledges how much she hurt Lexi, which aids in giving her the strength to remain clean throughout the rest of the school year, as we learn in her closing monologue. Now, on paper, this is great. Lexi finally finding the means and courage to express herself, how it leads to the mending of Lexi and Rue's relationship. But this feels false, contrived, not as impactful as it should be, since we didn't get a good sense of Rue and Lexi's history prior to this, and most of which is relayed to us via exposition jammed into the final 2 episodes, as opposed to us seeing it play out naturally over the course of the series. The show does a fantastic job of this when it comes to Rue's dynamic with other characters, namely her mother and especially Ali. These are relationships we see ebb and flow, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yet Lexi, who she has only a few minutes of screen time with in season 2, is the one to bring Rue around? It may work in theory, but not in execution. You have to earn these moments. As for where Lexi goes from here, I honestly cannot say. Obviously, following the tragic passing of Angus Cloud, her romance with Fez cannot continue. Perhaps the show will showcase Rue and Lexi rekindling their friendship, which would be nice, but it will have to work really hard to get rid of the sour taste in my mouth brought on by just how pretentious the whole play story arc was. And now that we are on the subject of things that leave a sour taste in my mouth, somehow only the second most dysfunctional member of the Jacobs family, Cal is a strange, though admittedly novel addition to the roster of what is supposedly a teen drama. A man who must hide his true self to uphold the facade of him being the picture-perfect family man, despite doing so, filling him with endless regret and deep resentment for those he claims to cherish. In season 1, I initially presumed he would be framed as a straight-up villain of sorts, namely in episode 4 when Cal recognizes Jules, with whom he had a sexual encounter with in the pilot, and pursues her. Me figuring this would lead to a subplot in which Cal tries to intimidate or threaten Jules to keep quiet. But to my surprise, he instead pleads with her not to ruin his life. To see such an imposing presence shrink himself down and humbly beg, I couldn't help but feel pity and even sympathy for him. Despite him putting on the front of being such a stoic emblem of traditional masculinity, he is merely a scared little boy, horrified of having his true self exposed and the life he has cultivated for himself taken from him. But there is a trap many narratives fall into in regard to this particular trope. Namely, that in its attempt to make us feel sympathy for a queer character who is forced to hide who they truly are, it ends up glossing over the not-so-cash money shit they pull in order to do so. In this case, the fact that Cal has for years been cheating on his wife and redirecting his own self-loathing onto his sons. And I feared this would be the direction the show would go in. In a season 2 flashback depicting Cal as a teenager, We see how he could not pursue love with his best friend, both as a result of his homophobic father and his future wife becoming pregnant straight out of high school. It felt as though the show was trying almost too hard to drive the nail in, to make us feel such an overwhelming amount of sympathy for Cal while wanting us to look past or even excuse his selfish actions. However, my worries were quelled come the scene where Cal finally decides to be honest with his family, owning up to his infidelity and expressing his disdain for his wife and children, blaming them for him being forced to live a double life, in complete denial of his own culpability in this situation. While we may feel sympathy for him for being suffocated by the pressures of heteronormativity, the show doesn't shy away from the fact that Cal has become a truly bitter person, him not able to fully grasp or simply not caring about how much damage he has inflicted upon them. And thus, the scene plays out like a tragedy, framing him as neither complete monster nor victim. His story a display of the damaging effects that one being pressured to not live as their true self can cause. As brutal as this scene was, I found it strangely cathartic, the facade finally coming to an end, though that doesn't mean the damage Cal has caused can simply be forgotten. Come the finale, upon Nate confronting Cal about how much his double life has led him to question his own, how he kept his father's secret, yet in return only received disdain, we see Cal try to express to his son how sorry he is, him acknowledging how his actions have led to Nate's lifelong distress. But Nate, not wanting an apology, but rather revenge, turns his father into the police, supplying them with the tape of him and Jules. Ironically, Cal spent his entire life lying about who he truly was to cultivate an image of the man he thought he was supposed to be, only to see everything he has built destroyed as a result of the consequences of said deception. Granted, I do have some problems with this climactic scene, namely how the audience's ability to view Nate with sympathy in light of his father's transgressions is difficult considering Nate's own transgressions, and how Cal's apology to Nate feels unearned. Considering the last time we saw Cal, he called Nate his biggest regret, and didn't seem to take any responsibility for his role in destroying his family. Granted, he was drunk in that first scene, but his animosity seemed genuine. Perhaps we are meant to view Cal as being disingenuous when he tells Nate that he's sorry, but I think we are supposed to read it as him being sincere. So, in that case, I don't think Cal's remorse was properly built up. We needed a bit more to illustrate that Cal eventually comes to see that he is responsible for his own situation. Regardless, and despite my initial reservations, I consider Cal to be one of the most deftly drawn characters of the show. But unfortunately, Cal's characterization is seriously compromised by the show deciding to have him be a massive scumbag who filmed his encounter with Jules without her consent, which in turn makes it hard to feel sympathy for him. Granted, Cal is still a scumbag, what with cheating on his wife and despising his own children, but the key is that the show holds him accountable. It explains why Cal made certain decisions without justifying or excusing them. There is a sort of balance, if you will. But even if you put aside that Jules was underage, which she lied about, him filming their encounter without her consent, in my eyes, throws this balance out of whack. Also, and this is like really odd, if you ask anyone who has seen the show, I think there is a good chance that they will come away with the impression that Cal filmed not just his encounter with Jules, but all of his sexual encounters without consent. However, at least in season 1, there is no explicit implication that they were in fact filmed non-consensually. In fact, in the second episode, we see that one of his partners is clearly aware that Cal is filming. Even in the scene with Jules, while we never see her give consent to have Cal film their encounter, we also never see her not give consent. I know that sounds sketchy, but there is no reason for the audience to presume that any of these encounters were filmed without consent, at least in season 1. However, come season 2, there is a scene in which Nate explicitly tells Cal that Jules didn't know Cal recorded their encounter. However, how would he know? But then later in the season, when Nate gives the tape back to Jules, it is confirmed that Jules did not know that Cal recorded her. She could be playing dumb, but I don't see why she would. This in turn leads to several questions. If Cal got consent from some of his partners to film their encounters, why wouldn't he do so for all of them? Also, this makes this line from Nate,
yeah, he secretly records every encounter he has,
provably false, since, as we see, at least one of Cal's partners was fully aware that Cal was filming. So what leads Nate to think that any of these encounters were filmed without consent? In addition, the show explicitly telling us that Jules did not know Cal filmed their encounter leads to a rather big plot hole. In season 1, when Nate blackmails her to keep quiet about her and his father, wouldn't Jules question how Nate found out about them? Cal telling Nate makes no sense, so the only way Nate could have found out about their encounter was if he saw the tape. So if Jules didn't know there was a tape, how does she think Nate found out about her and Cal? This is really just indicative of how poorly thought out the plotting of the show is in general, but the larger point I am making is that I don't think the show initially meant to imply that Cal was recording his encounters without consent. But for season 2, they decided to retcon this and imply that they were filmed secretly, which begs the question, why? Even if Jules consented to the filming, the video would still implicate Cal for statutory. So the fact that he filmed her without her consent has zero impact on the plot. All it does is frame Cal, a character I think the show wants us to at least somewhat feel for, as downright despicable. I am not exactly sure how Cal will factor into the story from here on out. To my understanding, the show plans to jump several years into the future, so perhaps we will see Cal still incarcerated, or we'll pick up with him following his release. Maybe we'll finally find out what is up with the mysterious third Jacob's brother. I thought this was just a continuity error from the pilot, but they didn't bother to change the photo come season 2, so maybe this will be explored down the line? But for me, the confirmation that Cal did record at least his encounter with Jules without her consent makes him far too much of a scumbag for me to feel sympathy for, so I don't really have much interest in seeing where he ends up. A clear instance of the show shooting itself in its own foot. And speaking of someone who would shoot themselves in the foot, sorry, I tried to have clever segues between each character section, but I couldn't think of one this time, and now I'm just aimlessly rambling, so I should probably just... Maddy's arc in season 2 is frustrating, seeing as I'd categorize her as more of a static character, primarily defined by her strong personality.
What in God's name is your problem? You
and of course, her indescribably toxic relationship with Nate, which is fine by me. Again, I don't think every single character needs to have some big arc or tons of development. So why then does season 2 seem to introduce the possibility that she will undergo some semblance of growth, only to completely drop the ball? In season 1, we learned that as a little girl, Maddy became obsessed with her own vanity, and set out to live a life where, via her brash personality, unapologetic confidence, and lethal looks, she could get by while basically doing nothing, not pursuing any particular passion or long-term goals, just tie the knot with some rich dude and enjoy a life of chilling by the pool with no need to worry about silly things like responsibility or becoming a person of substance. However, as we see throughout the show, Maddy is not a completely hollow shell. She is a loyal friend, has her moments of empathy and understanding, even if some of them aren't the most tactfully timed.
I don't mind if you're into guys.
Guys.
And has a softer side, which we mainly see via how she interacts with Theo, a young boy she babysits. But it is through her dynamic with Theo's mother, Samantha, that we find a chance for Maddy to come to reconsider her desired lifestyle. On the surface, it seems as if Samantha is living the life that Maddy has always dreamed of. Big house, rich husband, every extravagant excess a woman could ever want. Despite one thinking that this might make her overly conceited, Samantha is kind and warm to Maddy, going out of her way to make a connection. Which begs the question, Why does she do so? Perhaps because Samantha sees in Maddy the girl she used to be, and wants to urge her to not make the same mistakes that she did as a young woman, to not settle for a toxic relationship, to not exist as just a materialistic prop envied by women and lusted after by men, to not think of life as something to just let pass you by. And as a result of Samantha acting as a sort of mentor, perhaps Maddy will come to realize that she wants more in life, that so much constant drama is nothing but a drain on her soul, that she needs to make a change. But of course, this lovely dynamic goes absolutely nowhere. Samantha makes her last appearance in the penultimate episode of the season, gifting Maddy a dress she knew Maddy was trying on in her closet while she was out. It's a sweet moment, but doesn't seem to elicit any character shift in Maddy. I could see a scenario in which, come the finale, when Maddy sees Cassie storm the stage during Lexi's play after Nate breaks up with her, she has a sort of epiphany. Instead of allowing rage to cloud her better judgment, she views Cassie with pity, seeing how pathetic she looks as a result of being nothing more than a trophy to a man and making a fool out of herself. Perhaps it is at this moment that Maddy comes to see that she is wasting her time lending even an ounce of energy to a best friend who would betray her, or to someone who claims to love her but would abuse and threaten her. It is at this moment she is done. She decides against allowing any of this nonsense to occupy her life for a moment longer, and instead stands and exits, heeding Samantha's tutelage and seeking out something more. But instead, Maddy just pops off, runs on stage, and beats Cassie's ass, all over a guy who choked her, slept with her best friend, and put a gun to her head, so guess she is just the same old Maddy. Granted, there is a chance Maddy and Samantha will continue their dynamic in Season 3. It would be a waste to cast the Minka Kelly in a role with such potential, only for her to never make another appearance, but I can't help fear that the show will forgo giving Maddy a path to becoming something more, so they can just keep farming her temper for schlocky antics. I just hope that the end of Season 2 implies Maddy and Nate's relationship is finally done for good. I get that she is drawn to the darkness of their dynamic, but one would think that putting a gun to her head would finally make her call it quits. It's not like the show would decide to relentlessly torture and humiliate a character to no end for the sake of cheap drama. Right? So, let's address the sketchy elephant in the room. Sydney Sweeney's comments in regard to the amount of on-screen nudity that Levinson insisted be in the show are telling, to say the least. To be fair, Sydney has gone on record stating that her original comments were taken out of context. She never asked showrunner Sam Levinson to cut any scenes. Back in January, Sweeney told The Independent there were scenes where her character Cassie was supposed to be shirtless, and I would tell Sam, I don't really think that's necessary here, and he was like, okay, we don't need it. So contrary to the claims that Levinson forced or pressured Sweeney to do anything she was uncomfortable with, she clarified that she simply pushed back against a number of scenes where she was supposed to appear naked, and Levinson, to his credit, was respectful of this. However, I think this glosses over the deeper issue. Let's put aside the power dynamic between a showrunner and a younger actor who may be less inclined to speak up about doing something they are uncomfortable with so as not to be deemed difficult to work with. My question is, why was there so much scripted on-screen nudity for a show whose cast is made up primarily of high school-aged characters? It seems as if most of said nudity was so unnecessary that it could be easily cut, so why was it in the script in the first place? Despite Sweeney setting the record straight about her initial comments, it should come as no surprise that several other members of the cast, Minka Kelly, Chloe Cherry, Martha Kelly, and Austin Abrams, have spoken up about having to push back against the over-sexualization of certain scenes. To be clear, I am not someone who thinks that any and all sexual content even if it involves characters on the younger side, should never be permitted. But at what point does one raise an eyebrow at a creator putting so much exploitative nudity in a show, a great deal of which involves barely of age, if not underage characters? What is sadly ironic about the amount of exploitative nudity, specifically in regard to Cassie, is that it seems indicative of how Levinson himself views the character, as merely an object to be sexualized, something it seems the show is simultaneously trying to critique. In Season 1, Cassie is primarily framed as an object of lust and desire for the male characters, the sole exception being McKay. But he allows his insecurities about his own sexual prowess and Cassie's promiscuity to slowly erode their genuine connection. By the end of the season, it's as if he no longer views her as an individual with her own agency at all. The show seemingly cognizant of how Cassie only being seen as an object to be sexualized is destructive and dehumanizing. But this is undermined both by how much Cassie is sexualized by the show itself, which apparently there would have been a lot more of if Sydney didn't push back against it, and the fact that she has little to no deeper characterization. The show tries to give some deeper insight into her psyche. As a result of her parents' dysfunctional marriage and her father abandoning her family after falling victim to drug addiction, she was saddled with extremely low self-esteem, which not only leads to her promiscuity, but also her agreeing to partake in sexual activity on camera, even if she wasn't totally comfortable doing so. Cliches aside, this isn't enough in my eyes to compensate for the fact that she is still primarily defined by her relations to the male characters. The show critiques women only being seen as sex objects with little substance, yet treats Cassie as a sex object with little substance. But wait a minute, Mac, you are missing the point. Yes, in Season 1, Cassie is more or less depicted as a sex object, but this is so she can learn from her mistakes, that the men around her only see her as an object of desire, and that she should overcome her insecurities and no longer allow herself to be treated as such. Right? Absolutely not. Cassie's arc in Season 2 seems like it was specifically constructed to be an exercise in degradation, her being relentlessly humiliated by the show at any given turn, and I would argue sexualizing her even more than in Season 1. That she ends up getting with Nate at all is baffling, an attempt by the writers to just drum up contrived conflict. But the fact that we spend the entirety of the season constantly debase herself for him, it feels spiteful, mean-spirited. Now, one could argue that the entire point of this storyline is so Cassie can finally hit rock bottom. She is purposely written as utterly pathetic and to have no personality or substance outside of her relationship with Nate, so that she can finally come to the realization that she needs to make a change. Except the problem is that Cassie already learned this lesson in Season 1. She saw men she trusted leak her sex videos online. She had Daniel lambast her about how any guy that says he likes her beyond wanting to sleep with her is merely lying. She saw her romance with McKay disintegrate in front of her very eyes. She gets it. So why dedicate an entire season to her making these same mistakes again and again and again, only for her to wind up in the exact same spot she was at the end of Season 1? Furthermore, where does Cassie go from here in Season 3? Is Nate breaking up with her followed by her humiliating herself in front of the entire school, finally the moment where she realizes the error of her ways? Or will the show not be able to resist forcing a vapid love triangle between her, Nate, and Maddy? As Maddy states,
Don't worry, this is just the beginning.
Whatever the that means. Perhaps I am simply mistaken as to what this show was meant to be. I figured that the show wanted to showcase young adults making understandable mistakes which they could then learn and grow from. But I suppose it is more appealing for Levinson to just torture these characters and have them never learn from their experiences, because how else are we going to drag this out for another season? While I do have to give Levinson some credit, as I think Fez on the page is a fantastic character, an empathetic soul, and loyal friend despite his criminal occupation, one cannot deny that he was brought to even greater heights by the effortless magnetism of the late Angus Cloud. It was only during the making of this video that I learned Angus had never acted prior to starring in Euphoria, him being discovered while working at a restaurant, thus it being evident that he had as much effortless charisma in real life as he did on the show, bringing to Fez a palpable warmth, while also depicting him as a young man with a storm brewing within, someone who will go to extreme lengths to protect those he cares for. Fez is not only responsible for a number of the funniest, most devastating, most white-knuckle, and most satisfying moments of the show, but drops some of the best line deliveries of recent memory.
She came in yesterday looking all Sailor Moon and
Well, before you say no, you kind of have to let me finish, right?
hell the no.
Why do you keep saying that?
I did not like the way that the plan started.
Well, you have to let me finish the plan.
No.
Yes?
Hell the no, Rue. Why you acting like that was fun, Rue? For real, you pissing me off. What's with your family? Are you all just a bunch of assholes?
You beat up my son.
Yeah, well, he deserved it, man. He's a bitch.
I'm extremely confused.
You're confused. I'm confused, bro.
All of which is more impressive considering that Fez was originally meant to be restricted to a more minor role and was even supposed to be killed off at some point in season 1. Angus's performance being so strong that it quite literally altered the fate of his character. And likely as a result of the ecstatic reception to the character, season 2, in at least one intelligent move, decided to expand his role, giving him a touch more depth and even setting up a potential redemption arc. We learn how Fez got involved in the drug game, him continuing to do so to provide for both his ailing mother and adopted brother Ash. Then there is his disarmingly sweet romance with Lexi, opening an avenue for Fez to change his ways. Lexi being one of, if not the only one, to ever challenge Fez, asking him how, as a man of faith, he is able to reconcile his criminal actions. This in conjunction with the immense guilt he feels over his complicity in Rue falling deeper into the throes of addiction, as well as a number of perilous close calls resulting from his occupation, introduces the possibility that Fez may decide to leave the drug game behind, before it costs him either his freedom or his life. Him paying the heaviest toll of all come the end of season 2, when Ash is killed following a police raid on their home. If we were to see a continuation of Fez's story, the show could either have him become a darker character, the warmth I spoke of earlier being snuffed out, him no longer seeing the point of ever pursuing something better, or have this be the moment he decides to leave his drug-dealing ways behind and find a new lease on life, setting out to repair his relationships with those he holds most dear, either of which I am sure would have been a delight to see Angus partake in. But sadly, following his passing in 2023 at the age of 25, it is likely we have seen the last of Fezco's story. I simply wanted to take some time to praise a truly talented actor taken from the world far too soon, and offer a tribute to my personal favorite performance and character of the show. Nate motherfucking Jacobs. Before I discuss the bustling clown car that is Nate's mental health, I want to propose a theory that explains why Nate's arc is so much more intense compared to the rest of the cast, and frankly doesn't feel like he belongs in what is ostensibly a coming-of-age teen drama. I assert that Nate is a victim of what I will coin post-pilot syndrome. As I am sure many of you know, shows get picked up by networks in a number of different ways, but in some cases, a creative team will shoot a pilot episode as a proof of concept, with the hopes of getting a full season order. Shows that followed this path include The Sopranos, Lost, and Game of Thrones. This means that, in some cases, The pilot is filmed months before the rest of the season, and as a result of studio input or new ideas from the writers, there can be notable differences between the pilot and the rest of the show. Tony's voice in The Sopranos, Tyrion's hair in Game of Thrones, the aspect ratio of the bear. Most of the time the changes are small, if noticeable at all, and don't result in any sort of major dissonance. But Nate Jacobs is a special case, there being a blatant contrast in demeanor. The Nate Jacobs of the pilot is not the Nate Jacobs of the rest of the show. In the pilot, Nate comes off as more of your run-of-the-mill meathead. Cocky, loud, boisterous. However, at some point during the writing of the rest of Season 1, Levinson apparently had the idea of changing Nate's characterization from jock stereotype to adolescent Michael Myers, a disconcertingly stoic boiling pot of borderline sociopathy. I'm not really sure what the reason for this change was. Perhaps Levinson thought his portrayal in the pilot was simply too cliché. However, the issue is that, for me, he simply isn't believable. Based on his desire to play the hero, I could see him kicking the ass of Tyler, the dude who Maddy said had sex with her while she was blacked out, but not stalking him, breaking into his home, and beating him to within an inch of his life. Assault, blackmail, coercing false police confessions? More like Jacob Edgelordy, am I right?
You suck!
Nate, being such a sinister psycho, ends up muddying the waters when the show has him cool it with the Vic Mackey shenanigans and attempts to dissect his psychology. The implication being that as a result of him being exposed to his father's collection of videos of him having sex with dudes and trans chicks as a child, come young adulthood, he begins to question his own sexuality, the resulting inner turmoil weighing heavy on his psyche and causing him to try and compensate. On the outside, he's an all-American boy. On the inside, a seething ball of repressed rage, constantly on the cusp of combusting into violent frenzy. He is, in effect, a young man at war with himself. At first glance, this is a decent setup to explore the complexities of sexuality. Despite Jules being the one person he feels a sincere connection with, he is held back by the fear that his attraction to her puts his identity into question. Does Nate being attracted to Jules make him gay, despite the fact that she presents as undoubtedly feminine? How is one's sexual orientation determined? By gender? By sex? Neither? Both? Is putting so much emphasis on strictly trying to categorize one's desires a frivolous exercise that can cause more harm than good? I certainly believe so. Yet, as a young man, I recall being concerned about how I was perceived. Too feminine, acting gay, etc. Something I am sure many men, especially younger men, deal with to this day. Therefore, I consider this a suitable arc that many viewers can likely relate to. The issue is that Nate is straight up nutty, my dude, which, instead of making his struggle with his sexuality relatable, only ends up reinforcing a number of negative stereotypes. I have spoken on this channel before about the armored closet gay trope, where a character, usually a man, who is insecure about their homosexual desires may try to compensate by being overly hostile towards those who are openly gay. And I have also detailed how the use of said trope, even if done so with good intentions, can be a bit prickly, since it not only seems to imply that the prevalence of homophobia is perpetuated primarily by members of the gay community itself, but also that any man insecure about his sexuality could be a ticking time bomb of explosive vitriol. And Nate Jacobs is the apotheosis of this negative stereotype. A young man so pressed about not being 100% straight that it drives him to commit multiple felonies before receiving his high school diploma. In contrast, the show Freaks and Geeks features an arc in which the character of Ken discovers that his new girlfriend Amy is intersex, and we see him struggle with how to handle it. He is confused and angry like Nate, sure, but his behavior is what we would expect from a kid his age. Nate's turmoil may be relatable, but his resulting disposition, not so much. Thus, instead of his characterization generating empathy, it comes off as exploitative, drama for drama's sake. This is aside from the fact that his supposed romance with Jules doesn't really fly either. I think the show wants us to buy that Nate does have sincere feelings for her, the Tyler persona he concocts being his true self, if you will. But considering how much of an antisocial cantaloupe Nate is, why should we believe a single word he says? Consider, in the back half of season 2, after Nate retrieves the tape of his father and Jules together, he gives it back to her as an apparent sign of good faith, telling her that he meant everything he said about his feelings for her. But then later, we see that he put the tapes on a flash drive, which he then turns over to the police. So, giving Jules back the tape didn't functionally change anything. So was this simply a ploy to get back on her good side? This would track, since at no point do we ever see him be all that genuine with Jules. Mostly just manipulative and abusive. Catfishing her, blackmailing her, forcing her to make a false police report. If he would lie in an attempt to manipulate her into thinking he was protecting her, why should I believe he is being sincere about how he feels for her? Or Maddy, or Cassie for that matter. You can't have him consistently act like a sociopath and then expect us to buy into the idea that he is being genuine in certain contexts. It's yet another case of the show shooting itself in its own foot. But hang on, Mac, you're being disingenuous here. Nate's violent tendencies aren't simply a product of him being insecure about his sexuality, but the psychological trauma of being exposed to his father's sex videos. Okay, look, I am not an expert in the field of childhood trauma. I haven't read up on what effects being exposed to content like this at a young age could have on a child. But you know what? I will bet you $1 million that neither has Sam Levinson. I don't think he cared all that much about depicting said trauma accurately. Rather, it's used as an excuse to drama farm that only perpetuates stereotypes about childhood trauma victims. Issues processing emotions and controlling anger? Sure. Malicious narcissistic intent? Not so much. At worst, there are moments where the entire plotline feels like an instance of the writer's not so thinly veiled fetish rearing its ugly head. And then of course we have his dynamic with his father Cal. I can't say for sure if the text of the show is trying to insinuate that Nate's questionable sexuality and or his antisocial tendencies are a direct result of him being exposed to his father's tapes. However, I think it is clear that Nate both blames his father for his mental turmoil as well as holds a great deal of resentment for him. His father pushing him to be this perfect golden boy, all the while lying about who he truly is. Even later, when Cal blows up his family, Nate doesn't seem to be all that upset with him for doing so. The show explicitly telling us that Nate doesn't care all that much about his mother or his brother. Rather, he is envious of his father. Why should he be able to wipe the slate clean, to live free and open about who he is and how he feels, leaving scorched earth in his wake? Which in turn leads to Nate taking his revenge. I'd like to say this scene offered at least a shred of catharsis, that it made me feel some sense of relief for Nate, but again, you can't have a character victimize almost every other main character and then expect the viewer to feel sympathy for them. Also, this scene makes no sense. Earlier we are told that Nate gets rid of his father's video collection as it could threaten him taking over his father's business. But then we learn he put them all on a flash drive for insurance? Insurance for what exactly? Also, it was hilarious how we see him loading the gun in the car, only for him to pull it from his pocket in front of Cal, only to put it in his other pocket to pull out the drive, which he already called the police to inform them about. So why did he have the gun exactly? Just another instance of manufactured tension, I suppose. While this would admittedly be a lackluster finale to Nate's arc, I am left clueless as to where Nate goes from here in Season 3. Cal's in prison, the videos are exposed, the conflict with Fez obviously cannot continue, so I guess we could have another whole season of him driving Cassie to the brink of insanity? Oh boy. Maybe they'll revive the whole feud between Nate and Rue? Oh yeah, remember how at the end of season 1, Rue confronts him about messing with Jules, hinting at a future conflict between the two, and then they proceed to not interact a single time in the entirety of season 2? Maybe they'll try to give him a redemption arc, which...
Good luck.
I just hope they don't try to make a Nate and Jules romance happen, considering all of the torment he has inflicted upon her. The poor girl has been through enough. Speaking of which, Jules' characterization is a double-edged sword in my eyes. Often out of fear of perpetuating negative stereotypes, as well as a lack of representation within writers' rooms in general, there is a tendency for LGBTQ characters to be pigeonholed. While in the past, transgender characters, for example, were depicted as deviants or villains, today there are instances of the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction. Trans characters being portrayed as innocent angels who can do no wrong. However, this in turn leads to said characters lacking complexity, being flat, boring, or, at worst, more or less plot devices. Their only purpose in the story being to have suffering inflicted upon them as a means to generate sympathy from the audience and or teach the other characters a valuable lesson about tolerance. Despite good intentions, it ends up restricting trans stories to these same one-note narratives. Hence, why it is so refreshing that Jules, one of, if not the, most notable trans characters in media today, goes against the grain in this regard. That is not to say the show doesn't explore her struggles as a young trans woman, us being given insight into Jules' childhood and experience with gender dysphoria. But rather, it is not afraid to explore facets of her characterization that others might deem off-limits. Specifically in the special episode, which consists almost entirely of Jules in a therapy session, which I contend stands as one of the highlights of the series, mostly due to it being co-penned by Hunter Schafer herself, in which Jules discusses her struggle with reconciling her own sense of femininity with her desire for male validation, even musing about possibly going off her hormones, something I can't even imagine another show daring to explore out of fear of being seen as insensitive. It elevates Jules from being a tired stereotype, allowing her to be as much of a messy, contradictory, flawed individual as any other character. The issue is that Levinson simply isn't that good of a writer, and thus Jules, though it is not as a result of her being restricted due to being the token trans character, isn't done justice. In season 1, one could say that Jules was rather underwritten, her being more or less relegated to being the object of Rue's affections. But I would argue that this is at least semi-intentional, the show illustrating that Rue's infatuation with Jules, like her drug abuse, is yet another means by which Rue wants to escape the bleakness of her reality. Rue does not see Jules as a fully fleshed out individual with her own desires and flaws, but merely a fantasy, one she is finally able to reject come the end of the season, after deciding against running off with Jules to New York. So come season 2, I figured we would see Jules be given more depth, allowing the audience to see her as more than just a fantasy. It first appears as if this will be the case, Jules' special episode delving into her own personal struggles. Specifically, we gain insight into how Jules' dynamic with her alcoholic mother influences her relationship with Rue. How despite Jules knowing it is not healthy for her to be around Rue, it is difficult for her to distance herself as Rue has become so dependent on her for support. She loves Rue, but also resents that she is saddled with the burden of being responsible with her sobriety. I figured we would see more of a balance between the two, them being given equal weight in terms of their relationship dynamic. However, come season 2, I was disappointed to find that Jules once again had her entire existence tied to her dynamic with Rue. Jules rekindles their relationship in the premiere and then spends most of the season sitting around and doing nothing solely so she can bear witness to Rue hit rock bottom. Are we going to gain more insight into her fractured relationship with her mother?
No!
she doesn't interact with either of her parents once in the entire season. Will we explore how Nate's betrayal messed with her? How she is in turmoil over still having feelings for a person who in truth never really existed? Perhaps the fallout of him blackmailing her to make a false witness statement?
No.
She and Nate only share a single scene together. It's noted in season 1 how Kat and Jules were in summer school together, and in season 2, Kat expresses to Jules that she wishes they were closer. Might we develop her and Kat's friendship?
No!
After said scene with Kat, they don't interact a single time over the course of the entire season. It's all about Rue. This is putting aside the baffling decisions the show makes for her character, even in the scope of Rue's story, namely her cheating on Rue with Elliot. I get that it's established in season 1 that Jules vies for the validation of others, but her doing something so rotten doesn't seem in line with her character. You can't even argue that this was done to drive a wedge between Rue and Jules, since Rue never finds out about it. Elliot ends up telling Jules that Rue has been lying about being clean, which leads to Jules telling Leslie, which results in Rue saying Jules is dead to her, all of which could happen without Jules cheating. Maybe they will try to stir up some love triangle drama with this in season 3, but personally, I could not possibly care less. This sadly feels like the exact same situation with Kat. Levinson doesn't appear to relate to Jules as a character outside of how she exists in relation to Rue's development. But instead of deferring to someone who might be able to give deeper insight, give suggestions on where to take her arc, I guess he was just like,
Who cares?
In yet another instance of bleak irony, while season 1 critiques Rue only seeing Jules as an accessory to her life as opposed to an individual, season 2 restricts Jules to being that very thing, her not existing as a person outside of Rue's field of view. I am frankly at a loss as to where Jules is meant to go from here, since at the end of season 2, Rue has made peace with how her and Jules are not together. I am not against the show revisiting their dynamic, but please, for the love of God, can we get something more of substance for Jules? One can only hope, though I am not optimistic, since there seems to be only one character that Levinson is able to personally connect with and relate to. Of course, despite all of the negatives I have stated about the show thus far, that is not to say it does not have its moments of greatness, its crowning achievement undoubtedly being the character of Rue. In contrast to the more gaudy and sensationalized storylines of other characters, Rue's arc, primarily focused around her struggle with drug addiction, is fueled and driven by brutal honesty and genuine empathy. The contrast between the more stylized sequences depicting how her drug use warps her perception and the stark, grounded scenes in which we see the reality come crashing down upon her. Us watching as her loving relationships with her mother and sister are torn apart, seeing Leslie do everything she can to save her daughter, only to be driven to the point of being forced to forsake one child in order to spare the other. Rue's dynamic with Ali being absolutely phenomenal. In a show drenched in visual overindulgence, a simple conversation in a diner is somehow one of its most riveting highlights. A man who had his life destroyed by his addiction trying to help a young woman avert a similar fate. How empathy and vulnerability can build a friendship only for it all to be ripped away in a single moment of cruelty, yet persevere through the strength of forgiveness. How grief can make one fall in love with an idea rather than a person. The loss of friends, pain, torture, mercy, absolution, simply incredible. Her storyline influenced by Levinson's own experiences with drug use as a teen, explaining why it feels the most realistic and is given the most prominence. Far and away the best the show has to offer. However, I do have a few points of contention. The first being the Lori plot. At the beginning of season 2, Rue has a harrowing encounter with a disconcertingly pleasant drug dealer by the name of Lori. Later, Rue is forwarded thousands of dollars worth of drugs by her under the presumption that Rue will have her friend sell them on her behalf. Though it is clear Rue just intends to do all of the drugs herself. But after Rue's mother flushes the remaining stash, Rue is left in crisis as Lori threatened to sell her into sex slavery if she did not pay her back. In theory, I understand the function of this subplot. Like her terrifying encounter with Mouse in Season 1, it is meant to show how Rue's addiction, beyond destroying her personal relationships, also results in her carelessly putting herself in peril. Case in point, when Rue hits rock bottom and returns to Lori, who injects the strung-out Rue with morphine. Rue awakens the next day to find the door to the exit padlocked. Presuming Lori intends to sell her into slavery as a means to recoup the money Rue owes her, Rue escapes from her clutches, and then nothing happens. Rue just goes home and cleans up and yeah, no more danger. Like, shouldn't Rue go into hiding? Shouldn't she be more concerned that there is apparently a psychotic drug dealer out there looking for her? As sensationalized as I think the crime drama aspects of the show are, you can't just introduce something this major to your story, use it as your main source of tension throughout the season, and then have it evaporate in an instant with no resolution. It seems that Lori will be returning for Season 3, but in that case, are we just looking at some run-of-the-mill drug dealer seeks retribution arc? I think this entire plotline was ill-conceived from the jump, so maybe it's better off if the show just forgets it. My second critique is one that I find, above all else, drastically sours the quality of Rue's arc and frankly the show as a whole. I am talking, of course, about Rue meets Elliot in the Season 2 premiere, and they quickly become drug buddies. Rue introduces Elliot to Jules, and they become a sort of friend trio. Jules proceeds to cheat on Rue with Elliot because reasons, and later, Elliot informs Jules that Rue is in fact not clean, which leads to their fallout. And all of this makes no sense for so many reasons. Consider, Elliot telling Jules that Rue is still using seems to indicate that he is looking out for Rue's well-being. But this rings false considering, 1, he hooks up with Jules behind Rue's back, which doesn't frame him as if he is all that good of a friend to her, though some have argued that perhaps Elliot thought that they were open, although in that case, why would they feel the need to hide it from Rue? And 2, Elliot is doing drugs with Rue. The first time they meet, she almost goes into cardiac arrest. Clearly he knows she has a problem, especially taking into account that he knows she is lying about being clean. So I don't buy the idea that Elliot ends up telling Jules out of concern for Rue. Maybe he comes clean because he caught feelings for Jules and feels guilty lying to her? Like, okay, but then are there any consequences to this? A follow-up scene where Jules confronts Elliot about lying to her? Establish another dynamic the show can explore in the future? Nope, they don't speak a single word to one another for the rest of the season. And then there is...
Fell right on my...
Excuse me! What's with the song?
In the finale, Elliot apologizes to Rue for telling Jules that she was using, and then proceeds to play a song he wrote for her. But not just a verse, like the full 3.5-minute thing. This was a straight-up unironic version of one of those Conway Twitty sketches from Family Guy. Despite the show trying to insist that Rue and Elliot have this deep friendship, it comes off as inauthentic. All we get in terms of building their dynamic is them hanging out a few times and doing drugs, and then Elliot hooks up with Jules behind Rue's back. Wow, thanks buddy.
Thank you.
Similar to my complaint about Rue and Lexi's dynamic, if you want us to become invested in a particular relationship, you have to earn it. Illustrate to us how close they have become, instead of insisting it. Apparently there was a theory that Elliot was going to OD at some point during the season, the trauma of his death being the catalyst for Rue deciding to get clean, which I am glad they didn't go with, since just creating a character to kill them off to spur the protagonist in the change feels pretty cheap. However, then the question is, what is Elliot even doing here? The only plot beat he has any influence on is when he tells Jules that Rue is still on drugs. But couldn't have Jules figured this out on her own? Why not have Fez call Jules out of concern after Rue comes to him with her plan about getting Lori to front her drugs? Why not have Gia discover the briefcase after suspecting that Rue is using again? There are so many other characters who Rue already has an established dynamic with. So why create an entirely new character? Did he win a contest? Is he the kid of some producer or something? All I can hope is that the show decides to cut their losses, let this dynamic rest, and not have him return.
God f***ing damn it!
And my final gripe is the way Rue's battle with addiction gets wrapped up rather quickly come the end of season 2. For the entire length of the show, we bear witness to Rue's struggle to stay clean, and the resulting disastrous effects on her life and her relationships. But then over the course of like 1 or 2 episodes, we see Rue seemingly triumph over her addiction. Her stating in the season's closing monologue that she was able to stay clean for the rest of the school year. For a show that was brutally realistic when it came to showing just how difficult it is to overcome addiction, how a single moment of weakness can reverse years of progress, it just seemed to happen too suddenly, us only getting a few glimpses of Rue's road back to sobriety. Which in turn leads to another worry of mine. Now that season 3 is on the horizon, what is going to happen to Rue? Perhaps she stays clean and we see her attempt to repair her relationships with those closest to her. Although, since neither Nika King nor Storm Reed, who portray Rue's mother Leslie and younger sister Gia respectively, are slated to return for season 3, so I can't see how that would work. Perhaps we will see her take on a mentor role for another character, similar to how Ali mentored Rue. There are ways Rue's story could continue. But I fear that in an effort to keep the show alive, Levinson will just have her relapse again. I understand that staying sober is not a one and done thing, but seeing a season 2 capped off with such a tidy conclusion to Rue's story, having her relapse again would just feel gross. Instead of depicting the genuine experience of an individual struggling with substance abuse, the show doesn't know what else to do with her, so she just keeps relapsing and recovering over and over to keep the story going, which feels exploitative and cheap. Despite my critiques, I think Rue's arc is the strongest of the show, and I am at least tentatively curious as to how they continue her story. Let's hope for the best. When I set out on my Miracle Disaster series, my intention was to highlight media of which I consider there to be a dearth of discussion about here on YouTube, seeking to select high quality and groundbreaking shows that I feel aren't given the credit they deserve, or media that, despite an overall disappointing final product, is at least interesting to analyze in terms of structure, themes, etc. To put it simply, with each project, I want to try to bring something new to the table. With that in mind, some of you may be curious as to why I decided to select Euphoria, a show about which everything there is to say has likely already been said, that isn't particularly original or innovative through a narrative or thematic lens, that most would agree lost its way come its sophomore season, and ultimately isn't anything to write home about. However, I would contend that Euphoria is indicative of a larger issue with modern media aimed at young adults, and may stand as the most prominent example of said phenomenon. Namely, after watching the series several times and writing close to a novella's length analysis on it, there remains one question that I cannot for the life of me find an answer to. And that question is, at the risk of being overly reductive, when it comes to shows aimed at a young adult audience, though I think this applies to all young adult media, whether it be film, literature, what have you, I would argue there are two broad yet distinct categories that most shows fall into. Shows about being a teenager, and shows merely about teenagers. Let's begin with shows about being a teenager. These are shows that are primarily focused on depicting a relatively realistic portrait of young adulthood. My own personal prime example of this sort of show would be Boy Meets World, following one Corey Matthews as he experiences the trials and tribulations of adolescence. first love, best friends, heartbreak, loss, everything that a boy is faced with on his journey to become a man of the world. The key with a show like this is that it is wholly genuine, largely if not entirely absent of pretense or sensationalism. While this in turn may make the show seem lacking in dramatic flair, this is, in essence, the entire point. The show attempts to chronicle how a young boy would realistically deal with realistic scenarios in a realistic world, to relate to its intended audience with complete sincerity and earnestness. Other shows I would put into this category include Freaks and Geeks and The Wonder Years. And then you have shows merely about teenagers. These are shows that, while the primary characters may be teens, aren't all that focused on depicting a relatable teenage experience. Perhaps the most prominent example of this sort of show is the one, the only,
Gossip Girl.
a show where, yeah, the characters are said to be in high school, but rarely do they act, or talk, or behave, or react, or even look like teenagers. It's less concerned with depicting a realistic young adult experience as opposed to being a vehicle for drama, and more drama. The goal of a show in this category is to depict a more sensationalized view of the teen experience, full of stuff that isn't all that relatable to your average kid. Oodles of casual sex and drug use, nonchalant teacher-student affairs, hell, sometimes even murder. Other examples include Pretty Little Liars, Riverdale, and Skins. To be clear, I don't have an issue with shows like this existing. It's not like they tout themselves as, nor would the vast majority of their audience argue that they are meant to be realistic. It's about depicting a more fantastical world, there often being a clear and present tongue-in-cheek tone. And obviously, this is a sliding scale. Shows of the former category may include more romanticized elements, and shows of the latter may still utilize classic coming-of-age tropes. However, it seems like today, more and more shows are doing away with the former altogether. Not at all interested in crafting a realistic and/or sincere depiction of the modern teen experience. Everything is dramatized, sensationalized, romanticized, drenched in satire and irony. Because that's what the kids want. They don't want overly sentimental garbage that employs earnestness to teach lessons about the importance of friends and family, that the world can be scary and unpredictable, but that with the help of loved ones, you can overcome any obstacle life throws your way, grow from your mistakes, and become a better person. Right? Do you agree with this sentiment? And if so, why is it that shows of the past, while some may say they are cliché or naive by today's standards, still resonate? Is it because, contrary to this belief, young adults yearn for this type of sincerity? Reassurance that they are not alone in their confusion and fear of the future? That someone genuinely understands exactly what they are going through? What makes young adults today any different than the young adults of the past in that respect? Don't they too deserve media that offers sincerity, reassurance, and understanding? But hang on, Mac, you may say. This isn't that big of a deal, since the aforementioned shows of the past still exist. You said yourself that these shows are timeless in a sense. A kid today can watch Boy Meets World or Freaks and Geeks and still resonate with the experiences of the characters. And it's not like these shows didn't deal with heavy themes, so what's the issue? The issue is that the world depicted in these shows no longer exists. Changing attitudes towards sex and drugs, social media, dating apps, porn. While shows of the past may still be relevant in some ways, they simply don't cut it in others. As I am sure you've noticed, throughout the video I have used several clips from one of my favorite films, the 1985 classic teen drama, The Breakfast Club, a benchmark for the genre of sorts. Perhaps one of the most sincere, genuine, and earnest depictions of adolescence ever put to screen, at least in my eyes, that tried to capture, without a shred of pretense or irony, what young adults of the time were going through. Yet, while the film holds up in many ways, it is still a product of its time, made for a different generation, and thus, I ask you, dear viewer, what would you say is the Breakfast Club of today's day and age? And, as strange as it sounds, I would argue that Euphoria Season 1 comes the closest to holding said title than any other piece of media of recent memory. Yes, it does include plenty of sensationalized and over-the-top drama fodder, but there is still so much that surprisingly comes off as timely and authentic. McKay's warped view of intimacy due to the influence of porn and toxic masculinity, Kat and Cassie each struggling with their sexual identity and how it is influenced and complicated by the internet and social media. Nate's torment over his attraction to a trans girl due to persisting archaic attitudes about sexual orientation. Obviously, it didn't handle all of this in the most astute of fashions, but there was potential. The feeling that it was at least attempting to depict the timely and relevant struggles of today's youth with empathy and sincerity. My hope, come season 2, was that the show would ultimately decide to tone down the sensationalism, to dare to make a genuine attempt to craft a realistic depiction of the modern teenage experience. Yet sadly, it seems that it went pedal to the metal in the opposite direction. The characters who I felt were given the most earnest and timely story arcs, they were effectively written off the show altogether. Any appearance of characters growing from their experiences and mistakes, instead they were consumed by their flaws, undergoing no change, and become even more hyperbolic versions of themselves. Even the admittedly quality elements end up being tainted by leaning into crassness. The brutal realism of Rue's arc in particular being bogged down by the show amping up the crime drama aspects. Case in point, deciding to make Ash a mini murder machine for some reason. Any chance of seeing these characters grow from their mistakes is largely cast aside in favor of gaudy exhibition. Drama for drama's sake, which is indicative not only in its narrative, but also its visuals. The show amping up the spectacle for season 2, but none of it carrying a more substantive purpose. To communicate or emphasize character, to act in service to the story playing out on screen, it's just ostentatious, vulgar in its display, desperate for attention, eager to appear as if it is thoughtful and astute, all the while being about as deep as a kiddie pool. The greatest irony of all being that in a time when so many young adults are as confused and lost as they have ever been, when so much media tailored to them operates as escapist fluff, depicting a fantastical view of teen life which hardly any of them could possibly relate to, the most revolutionary thing Euphoria could have done was to embrace sincerity, to view its subjects as individuals worthy of empathy and respect, as opposed to merely lifeless puppets attached to strings, and, via chronicling their experiences, communicate to its audience that they are heard and seen, that misfortunes can lead to growth, that they can find their way through the fog. And yet, as a result of the arrogant belief that it is somehow above all this, it cast sincerity aside, amped up the sensationalism, and threw its characters to the wolves, all for the sake of vapid and boorish pageantry, in turn making Euphoria just like every single other show that is meant for seemingly no one and ultimately says absolutely nothing. Respectfully, you can keep season 3, Mr. Levinson. You've done enough. You have done nothing at all.